So let's start off with say learning outcome 5, and learning outcome 5 basically talks about the role of HR in an organization. Now, when we look at this particular slide, if you're going to see it slightly clearly, this particular slide, most of the slides in this particular presentation that I'm going to go through will use some sort of mind map. And because HR is a very extensive function, what we're going to look at is basically look at a few branches of HR to get our understanding and some overview of what the department is formed of, the role and responsibilities it has, and what kind of duties or responsibilities it executes. So how do we define human resource? What is human resource?
Well, the human resources are that help other companies better themselves.
Yeah, so in a way, what you've said is correct. Is human resource is nothing but when we're talking about human is basically a person or a people or person, and that when it is treated, when people in the organization is treated as resources, that means you have finance as a resource, you have infrastructure as a resource, you have say for example IT as a resource. Human or people which work and form the organization or a business are also considered at some point in time resources. Now, post the World War II, when the industrialization started to happen, a lot of people, gave up their traditional jobs, which is agriculture and other things that, we were engaged in before that. And what we did was we started to work in factories, we started to work in shift, we started to work in the modern industrialized world. And when a lot of people started to work together within organization, businesses, engineering, factories, coal mines, at some point in time, there was a department which was required. That means some type of management which was required to be done, and that is where the full function of HR department, as we see, actually came about. So the role of managing people as a resource within the organization is nothing but human resources. So here, when we look at people working within the organization, they were working because they have certain needs, they have certain motivation. You have some demands, you have some wants, and when you look at that, you're not working for free, you're not working for charity, you're working because you have to make ends meet or you have to earn a living, things like that. So the department looks after wide variety of functions with regards to managing the expectation of people working within the organization, and those are nicely summed up on this particular slide. So HR and the roles and responsibilities, when we look at it, we will call it human resources department, because the department will be formed up of individuals who are specialists in HR or understand the human resources function, and each of the person working with the department would be a specialist or would kind of derelict and work within a particular area of responsibility. So somebody would be a training manager, somebody would be looking after appraisal, somebody would be looking after payroll, somebody would be looking after new contracts, recruitment, selection, things like that. Right. But when we look at the whole aspect of this as a function in conjunction with a lot of other functions like finance, administration, engineering, production, and we look at the management of this function within the organization as one of the departments being managed by somebody who's heading this department, then this particular terminology that we end up using is something called human resource management. So management will be the art of managing the department in a way that it is able to do and complete the functions which the department is set out to do. So an HR department, say at the end of the month, processes salaries, wages, appraisals, looks after recruitment. So these are different functions. So when the functions are managed in an effective manner, that they seem to be working as one unit, we will call it as human resource management. Somebody who's managing those functions will be a part of the HR department or HR function and would be classified as a HR manager. Now, what are the responsibilities which HR does? You look after, when somebody works within the department or within the HR function, they will manage recruitment, selection. They will look at, for example, employee development. In some cases, when you look at new software being introduced with the firm, let's say Windows 7 moved to Windows 10, a lot of people would have required a bit, training. So training and development comes in. You look at reward management. So people who are performing well are meeting their targets or exceeding their targets are looking at rewards. Reward management is one of the key functions. When you look at reward management, could be done in the form of incentives, bonuses, perks being given, cash incentives, or other incentives as holidays and those kind of perks being given. You look at the whole aspect of managing trade unions. That means, if there are grievances and people working within the organization are part of trade unions like Unite and stuff. So the whole aspect of managing, negotiations and, managing labor laws are also one of the key aspects of HR department. HR in general is responsible also for ensuring the overall well-being of the organization, which is in terms of productivity, efficiency, motivation. That means they are the one which are, kind of tasked with setting out job descriptions which have meaningful linkages with aim, vision, and mission of the company. So if the board sets a target that this year we are going to double the turnover, then that is translated into job description, meaningful responsibilities for each employee by the HR department. That means they are responsible for breaking up the macro vision down of the board into clear, deliverable, tangible, smart targets, which then can be given out to resources or employees within various departments, various functions to be able to achieve the overall goal. So each department does a lot of functions, and this is a slide which kind of summarizes most of the functions which HR does. Now let's look at each of this function very briefly to understand what and where their involvement is. So what you will see is the mind map expanding out into individual functions in terms of branches. So recruitment is basically related with, when you think of recruitment, you think of job adverts, you think of job description, you think of recruitment things, brings to mind interview process, selection, shortlisting. You look at the aspect of for example, contracts. And what else can you think of when you think of recruitment?
When it comes to recruitment, I think people employing employees employing workers.
Yeah, that's correct. So when you think of the function recruitment, there are lots of sub activities which are carried out in the particular function. So recruitment essentially means that you have a job vacancy, or you have a vacancy for which you're trying to advertise to be able to get somebody into that particular role. So if a particular business has a vacancy for, say, let's say administration, so the process through which they will start to recruit the person or start looking at the whole process of getting somebody to fill that vacancy would be the process of recruitment. And here, when you look at recruitment, we have certain law and legislation to follow. For example, when you advertise, I just cannot say that I only want white or native speakers in the, to apply. I don't want people to apply from outside the UK. So if you have these kind of regulations, this is something which is where legislation kicks in. And what you have to do is you have to comply with certain laws which the government has directed, in particular for HR or human resources. So, for example, there is a Discrimination Act, there is an Equalities and Diversity Act, there is a Data Protection Act. So these are principal acts that we will look at, which you have to comply with when you place a job advert in the market. So I cannot say my job advert will only try and attract a certain segment of individuals for this particular role. What you have to do is journalize it so that you're not seen to be discriminating and you're not seen to be favoring any one particular type of applicant over the other. So these are things that you have to comply with. When we look at some of the employment laws in the later slide, we'll cover that. But recruitment in general is a process where you fill up a vacancy, you identify a demand or a need for a vacancy within the department. And once you see that particular demand or the need, then what you do is you put out a job advert, create a job description, and then you start the process of interview and shortlisting and selection to bring it to a closure wherein then somebody gets appointed. You offer a contract, somebody ends up joining the, the company for that position. Now, key steps that we will look at is, job descriptions. Obviously, before you even go out and advertise that you have a vacancy, you have to create a job advert. So think of job advert as a macro level activity which will be placed outwards. But once you start getting responses, you need to have a specific description in terms of having roles and responsibilities of what the job holder will do.
Definitely.
And to a certain extent, what you do is do a bit of matchmaking with the responsibilities and the job, the particular person is to do with these person specification. Sorry, that is that if you have a particular vacancy, like you want somebody in administration, let's look at within the administration, but you want to appoint a librarian. When you want to appoint somebody to work within the library, you have to have that person having certain amount of skills or specific skills which are required for the library. That means cataloging of books, understanding the titles, maybe a bit of an avid reader. These are skills or qualities that you would want to see in the person. Somebody who knows how to do databasing, or create a database of books of what they're issued, things like that will have to be looked at. So what you do is basically in the job description, you include things about the skill set that you want, the roles and responsibilities which the person is expected to do, and basis which you put out a job advert. So once the job advert is put out, applicants start applying, and what you start receiving in the emails would be what you receive when you see a job advert. In return, what do you see people replying with?
They reply with a yes or a no.
Yeah, they reply with a yes or no. But apart from that, what else do they send in the yes or no?
For interview date, if it's yeah.
Yeah. So no. Let me rephrase the question. So if you're interested in a job, you apply for the job advert. What do you then attach along with the job advert? If you're saying that I'm interested.
Your CV.
Yeah. So basically, once you see an advert and you're interested in a job, what you do is you apply by including a covering letter or maybe a covering, few words about why you're interested, and then you also enclose a copy of your CV. Now, assuming the department receives a lot of CVs, then they start the process of shortlisting or selection of candidates, right? So once the recruitment process has been initiated, you get some responses to your advert. Once the responses come in, we are then looking at the process of selection. And in selection, you start with the process of something called shortlisting. That means you will look at the keywords in the CV and try and match it with the job description that you put out. And then what you start to do is shortlist a few CVs from the ones which have been received to bring them to a stage of interview. And when you call them for a telephonic interview or you do a face-to-face interview, in that interview you're looking at kind of confirming what has been given on the CV. So you ask them to bring across maybe a copy of their qualifications, maybe work experience letters, and then you have a discussion to see if the skill set that you want is particularly present in that person. And then through the interview process, you start questioning this and checking this through the QA route, question answer route. Correct?
Right.
In some cases, when you go in for a first job interview, or if it's a important job interview, or depending on the position that you're interviewing for, you will also see that sometimes the candidates are required to make a presentation in front of the selection committee, or they give you a short presentation to make if they're asking you to test out certain skills in terms of public speaking, for example. They would also ask you to make a presentation or come prepared with a short presentation to give them a new perspective of how you would handle this role or how would you address this problem. And these are done because they want to test out your softer skills in the process of interview. So things like interview, then they'll want to look at soft skills like speaking, public speaking, looking at your presentation skills, looking at skills in terms of interjection or question answer session. And that is why sometimes when you go in for interviews, the the interviewers or the organization will ask you to do a short presentation. They also ask you to sometimes do or undertake some tests. Now, if you imagine in some cases when they are recruiting for senior positions like a CEO, what most organizations do is they involve some sort of testing to try and test the aptitude, and they do something called psychometric testing. And these are tests which are done to check out the personality, the various traits and soft skills of, the candidate. The reason why they want to do this is because what they want to do is they want to test out in some cases, if the employees have certain types of attributes, attitude, and also the aptitude to fit into that role. And these psychometric tests which are done, could be done for, testing out various skills within, a particular candidate. These are multiple choice question tests sometimes which are done. And these tests are typically, they consist of things like numerical reasoning or numerical testing. They would want to test your verbal reasoning, your problem solving skills. They want to look at, sometimes some of these tests involve things like situations. And in these situations, they ask you to kind of, provide answers. And they are looking at understanding a range in which you are supposed to answer. You do not want to be in the extremes, either too low or too high. What they want to be able to look at is in those kind of situational or tests which are done, they want to see your aptitude and they want to see your sense of reasoning, so that this will allow them to do some initial screening for the characteristics, skills, and also the aptitude for you to fit into that role. Okay.
Right.
There are lots of tests. Some of the tests, which you could look at doing, say on a trial basis to test it out, could be MBTI, which is Myers-Briggs personality tests. And these tests basically kind of put together a choice of multiple type questions to you. You answer those questions and it tells you what kind of personality type you are. Are you an aggressive personality? Are you a democratic? Are you somebody who gets along with everyone very well? So those are tests which you can also do for the sake of understanding. And I'll send you a link of one of these tests for you to take, which could at some stage, be put into your assignment from a point of view of, one of the tasks. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Now, selection as a process, depending on the type of position you're enrolling in for, or the seniority of the position, the selection process might involve a number of interviews, or in some cases it might be a simple. So, for example, if you're applying for an administrative assistant job, you might have a telephonic interview, a face-to-face, and on the basis of which the employer would decide, and they will offer you a letter contract, and you will join the position. But in some cases, if you understand, if you're taking on people in the senior management position, the selection process could be multifarious. That means it could go through a number of interviews, number of phases, through which you are then going to meet different kind of people in the organization before the the contract or the offer is given to you. So it varies organization to organization and on the type of the candidate, and also for the role that you are trying to recruit for. Is that okay?
Right. Yeah.
Now, when we look at one of the other key things in human resource management is employment legislation, and we are going to be focused on these 4 or 5 different legislations, which is basically looking at equal opportunities. We are looking at discrimination. We are also looking at union, for example, the ability for the person to be a part of union and the labor laws. We look at health and safety, and we look at certain EU directives which are a part and parcel of the employment legislation. So when we look at employment legislation, what do you think does employment legislation mean?
Employment legalization is a law set for workers, so it's fair for the workers. They're in a safe working environment.
Absolutely correct. So the employment legislation has been put together by the government, in order to safeguard and protect the rights and the rights of the individual working within the organization, so that the employers treat you fairly, and against which, if you do a bit of if you do a work, you're in a contract, then the appropriate wages and appropriate compensation is given to the employee for the services which the employee is offering to the employer. So the legislation is something which is developed over a point in time as a law, and this law has various facets to it, and these facets basically give rights to the employer and give rights to the employee, and kind of to a certain extent facilitate the meaningful working of employees within an organization or the employer side. Okay, so even if you look at a small hair salon, wherein the owner of the salon would have employed a few people who work within the salon, is a business and or an organization, and in this case, if you're employing people, the wages are to be paid on time. There is no discrimination at the time of recruitment. It provides a safe working environment. There are no health and safety issues. All those things are catered to by the employment legislation. Okay. Now, when we look at when you think of certain key terms which come which you would have come across, or I would definitely have come across, as things like, sometimes you see there are disabled badges which are issued to people who drive, but in order for them to have preferential parking positions. So if you look at any new store which opens up like Tesco's, Morrison's, when they create a parking area, they have to have by default allocations for people to be able to park which are disabled. So there is no discrimination on that aspect, and this particular legislation is applied across into all various fields of employment. So there is no discrimination against race, gender, or disability. People who have special disability or any sort of disability should not be kind of discriminated against when you are applying, or when they're applying for jobs, or when they are seeking out opportunities for work within organizations.
Right.
So this is a very key part of legislation which we look at, which is Equalities and Diversities Act, and also discrimination in particular, because sometimes some employees discriminate and say that we cannot do this, or we would not want to take that person on, and that would lead to something called discrimination. Now, there are other areas like discipline. So when you look at grievances, if you're not happy with your employer, you made a complaint, sometimes been unfairly dismissed from your job, then you can also approach the HR department to kind of seek remedies in terms of resolutions. Sometimes you will see that employees who do not perform to the objectives given in their job descriptions can also be disciplined by the HR department. That means the HR can sack you if you have not been able to keep time management or punctually attend office on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. And if it's because of any issue, for example, if it's because of an illness and other things, then they have to facilitate the reasons of why you have not been able to attend. And in some cases, HR department then goes out and then tries to kind of make available alternate arrangements for you to be able to attend. For example, some offices have when you look at the entrance, they have entrance for disabled customers or wheelchair customers as well, or wheelchair employees as well if they want to come in. There's an installation of a lift in some premises which basically is for disabled people. So if you are working in an organization and if you had an accident or something, and because of which there are some special arrangements to be made, and you get dismissed, and the employer says, no, I won't be interested in doing this or doing that, but they dismiss you, then you can go across to a tribunal, start with your grievance with the HR department. If they are not able to solve it, then you go across to an employment tribunal, go to ACAS, and then you have this resolved, because the employer needs to be able to provide the environment which allows you to work and efficiently work and productivity work within the organization. So in some areas, one of the key aspects of HR is to also look at discipline, and also look at tribunals, and also look at grievances, solving of grievances. Is that okay? And they are done through different forms. Sometimes you will see that if you're facing a redundancy, or maybe if you're facing a trial, then in those cases you go through a process of meetings, informal meetings, formal meetings with the employer, meetings which are verbal, documented. Sometimes these meetings happen within the presence of a solicitor, and then in these cases, if it does not get resolved, then it even leads up to court, which is where external agencies come in. That means the employer can take the employee, can take the employer to a tribunal, or vice versa, if they are not able to amicably kind of solve that situation within the organization itself. Now, one of the key things that we also look at in the case of HR is development. That means HR department or HR people working within human resources are required to continuously look at developing resources. So if there is a new skill, if there is a new software, for example, or a new piece of equipment which has been introduced, and you need training and development on it, then the HR department kind of facilitates that. What we get to see in most organizations today is that most large companies, most well-established organizations have something called CPD, or career professional development, happening for all employees from the top to the bottom of the organization for every employee within the organization. And what they are doing this and why they are doing this is they are trying to train people to be able to adapt to the new working environment, new legislations, and because of which there is a key function of HR which is called training and development. Now, training and development could be, for example, you've been working with a particular role for about 4 years and you're now looking at a change. So what they would want to do is you worked in sales, you want to come into marketing, for example, the HR, when they do their reviews, they will identify this as a need that the employee has been working quite well, has been performing and exceeding its targets, now wants to look at an area of development wherein he wants to move into marketing. So the HR department, in conjunction with the line manager, would basically look at putting together some trainings for you to develop you to be able to transition into that position or move into that particular role. And that area would be also something which the HR looks at in conjunction with your line manager or your department head. So they look at identifying opportunities, they look at identifying opportunities which could be in the form of promotion, both within the organization or within the particular business of business unit of the organization. So you want to move within the sales and marketing department, but move from front end sales to back office work. That is also looking at development. But in that case, it might not be a simple case of you just moving over, but they would also in this case look at giving you some training and development so that you are able to effectively work in that role when you work in that position. Is that okay?
Yeah,
so a lot of organizations, when you look at like Vodafone, Network Rail, Virgin, they have year-round programs wherein each employee is expected to complete at least 15 to 20 hours of continuous professional development. They want you to upgrade your skills, they want you to learn new things, and these are facilitated through the training and development within the organization for that individual. Okay. Now, development happen in the form of your training programs, seminars that you attend. Maybe you do an off-site training, which is organized by the organization. It could be that you are also doing training and development under a particular coach or a mentor. That means you as a person have been identified having the abilities to be able to take up senior roles in the organization. They might buddy you up or ask you to work very closely with a particular leader in the organization who's going to develop you and your skills to be able to take up that role. So development can happen in various forms. Companies can facilitate, organizations can facilitate development through training, but they can also facilitate development through the process of coaching and mentoring. That means they might align you or ask you to work closely with a set of individuals which will work with you to give you skills through their personalized attention, which is basically imparting their experiential skills so that you are able to pick it up. Okay.
Right. Yes.
Now, training and development, when we call T&D, is more or less similar, but development is long term and training could be short term. That is the key difference. So development is you're being groomed to become a leader within the organization. So that development will take 2, 3, 4, 5 years for you to get into the CEO position. But you've been identified as a key person who's performing well, knows the organization well, gets along with people well. You meet a lot of criteria, and that is why you're being developed to get into that role. Training would mean a short-term, program wherein you are being asked to pick up a new skill or being asked or tasked with getting, a gap area that you have, kind of covered up by doing a specific training. So example here would be, going back to what I mentioned earlier, is that if the organization is to move lock, stock and barrel from Windows XP to Windows 10 in an organization, that would mean that some employees within the organization would need training, not development, because they need to be able to understand and then use the new software which is being introduced so that they become more efficient and hopefully more productive with the use or employment of the new Windows operating system in the organization. So that kind of a transition which is happening from, you are already an IT user, you know how to use a PC, you come in, you log into your PC, you work at the office. But what is happening is they are trying to upgrade the software so that you are able to use an advanced version of the operating system, and that is Windows 10. So here, the idea would be to make you aware of the new features which have been introduced in the software although you know how to use the PC once it's upgraded by the IT department. So here you are going to be undertaking a training to use the new software which is going to be installed, and that is why it will be training, not development. Is that difference clear enough?
Yeah, the difference is clear.
Yeah. So trainings can be done, there are short trainings. Sometimes these trainings are off-site. Some of these trainings, could be a long training. Like an example would be if you're caught speeding, and sometimes they offer you, rather than taking up 3 points and paying £90, they offer you, or £60, I think, they offer you to take a race training, and the training is basically to refresh your, knowledge on the rules and regulations while you drive within, say, for example, developed areas or town areas. So the trainings are basically for you to be able to refresh your skills, update your skills, improve your existing skills, or add on to your existing skills. Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah.
Now, one of the key things which organizations looks at is reward management, because you need to motivate your staff and keep motivated. Now, reward management is one of the key functions of HR. And here, when you join at, say, a certain level within the organization, your pay, your wages, your benefits, the kind of facilities that you get or perks that you get within the organization are dependent on what kind of role and responsibility you are taking up in the organization. So reward management is one of the key functions which HR looks at. And this basically is a function which deals with understanding, setting up pay levels, setting up, things like, let's put it this way, compensation, benefits, and what kind of, let's say, what kind of facilities or flexibility the organization needs to provide for you to be able to work effectively within that role. So in some cases, when you look at now, most of the modern organizations, which is what we get to hear as a term called millennial businesses, things like Deliveroo, things like Facebook, things like Uber, these are called millennial businesses because here the concept is you're self-employed, you're working for the company, you have flexibility in terms of the work hours. But at the same point in time, they were in the news a couple of weeks, months back, wherein they said, okay, Uber is not giving basic elements of employee perks to its drivers, which work as Uber drivers or provide the service under the self-employed basis, and they lost out that case in the courts, and Uber has then since then made certain changes in its policy. So, for example, it is said that if you are employed and you are on a contract with Uber, you will have access to things like the holidays. There is a contention that they want to include pensions. They want to look at sick pay and other bits and pieces of the important bits of legislation, which currently some of these millennial companies are getting away with. That means what they say is 0 contract hours, you can work on your own, it gives you the flexibility, that's fine, but they are not giving the basic benefits which a company needs to provide under the HR rules to individuals which are working on a contract, even on a self-employed basis or on a 0-hour contract basis. So rewards management is one such area within the HR that you have to look at, wherein the pay, the benefits, and the monetary oblique tangible and intangible benefits of working for that organization is decided by the HR in terms of your pay package. And that is one of the key functions which HR does in terms of reward management.
Right, yeah.
Now, trade unions. Sometimes you will see that they will play a very influential role, which is with regards to understanding, when disputes arise. So a lot of, people within the UK, when you look at, are members of trade unions. And when you look at, we are members of trade union, what role does trade unions play within the, the HR side is when the Trade Union Act of 1926 was introduced. It basically said that people who work within, say, for example, companies or production companies or engineering companies or organizations in general will need to be a member of the trade union, so that sometimes collectively the workers could seek to protect or promote, mutual objectives which the employers did not give them. Okay. Now,
Yeah.
there is a trade union act that we can look at in a bit more detail, and this basically details out things like why you could become a member of the trade union, what are the benefits of being a member of the trade union, what are the roles and responsibilities of trade union, and things like that. But in general, what we see is that when you look at HR, and in the case of any litigation or tribunals or arbitration which needs to happen, that means in some cases there are grievances which cannot be solved, then the members can resort to, people working within the organization can actually resort to something called you know trade unions. Now trade unions are nothing but they are basically a group of let's say a group of people who represent the worker's right against or for a particular employer. So in most typically what they tend to do is they set out terms and conditions, and these terms and conditions, when it is set out in a contract for the employee by the organization, can then be looked at if you feel that I'm not being given the right compensation, or if I'm not being given the right the various rights which are required for me under the Employment Act. If they've not been provided, then you can go to a trade union and they can then collectively represent this against, rather than just doing it for one person, they can represent it collectively for a number of employees against the employer. So HR part of it is to work and deal with these trade unions to amicably solve sometimes grievances or problems which arise. And sometimes employees, if they're unhappy, they're unfairly dismissed, or they've been discriminated against, then you can go to these unions. And HR part of it is to manage the efficient working with the trade unions. So sometimes some of the laws which are created, or policies which are created, have to undergo undergo a discussion with the trade unions to be able to be implemented within the organization. And this function is what we see in large production engineering related organization, or people wherein you have large scale manufacturing happening. So when you look at, for example, car factories, when you look at iron and steel, you look at, for example, big public sector businesses in general, that is where you will see the concept of trade unions. You can also see concept of trade unions within private sector organizations like Virgin Rail, Network Rail, things like that. But in general, this is like a mediating body which works on behalf of the workers to negotiate the rights and responsibilities of the workers with the employer. So HR department in some companies will have somebody who will deal with trade unions, and that person would be a specialist in understanding the labor laws, and would be a specialist in dealing with the trade unions from a point of view of understanding the legislation and law around labor laws. Is that okay?
Right. That's clear.
Now, they have various, obviously, what are trade unions? Basically, they are representative of employees. You can become a member of a trade union like Unite by signing on for an annual membership of, I think, 25 or 30 pounds a year. And if you face any problems with your employer, then you can go to the trade union and they will negotiate on your behalf and, provide all the services rather than you having to go through and deal with the employer directly. So if you feel that you've been discriminated against, or if you've not got anything which is something which is your legal right, then sometimes people become a part of the trade union, have memberships through which the trade unions can go and then negotiate on their behalf with the employers. Now, what key things which the key roles of the HR department is to maintain or have productivity with the organization. Now, if in a business, if you look at, you employ somebody in a particular role, okay?
Right.
Now, if you are paying certain amount of wages, what you want is a certain amount of output coming out from that individual. So if you've given a certain responsibilities for the person to be able to do, then in that case, that person, if you feel is not kind of doing the particular work or is able to do the work say well, or is not able to complete the work or the task given on time, then in that case the HR department's role becomes paramount. So what they do is they do a review. to see if the person is not able to do the role. Why is the person not able to do the role? Are they having all the necessary things required to be able to perform their duties? If they feel there are certain areas of gap in terms of either training required, development required, or there are certain resources which are not provided, which allow the person to be able to do the work effectively, then they are supposed to intervene and make sure that that is made available for the person, for them to be able to perform the jobs effectively. Now,
Right.
the reason why productivity comes in is that because there is a compensation or there is a wage being paid to every worker, every employee in the organization or in the business, at some stage you want them to pull their weight. So what the HR's role is to look at if the person is actually performing against the duties given or the roles and responsibilities set. Is the person able to effectively work within that environment and deliver the tasks or complete the jobs which are required for him to do so? And if they feel they are not doing it, then it leads to termination of job. So they measure productivity, they are responsible to look at efficiency and productivity so that the worker being compensated in terms of wages is able to perform well in the organization. It could be both ways, isn't it? If, for example, I'm responsible for responding to customers, but I don't have a phone on my seat, and every time the phone call comes, I have to get up and go to my colleague's desk to pick up the phone. That means it is a hindrance for you to be able to effectively work in your role. So you should have a desk phone on your desk itself, because you're the first line of contact for customers. But if that phone is on manager's desk, every time you have to go, you'll say, okay, there's a call for you. Every time you spend 3-4 minutes, or you go there and then you take a call and you come back. And if there's a follow-up call that you have to make, again you have to go to the manager's desk. So if this is making you unproductive, then the HR needs to recognize this and make sure when you start the work, you have a PC, you have a phone, you have a desk through which you are able to effectively operate and do the role. Right? And because of which, when you are able to do the role effectively well, you are considered productive because you are able to complete the goals or meet the targets which have been set by your manager or in your job description. Okay?
Yeah.
So they are responsible for measuring productivity in terms of ensuring that the person who's working in that role is able to do the job well and effectively. And if there is a difficulty in completing that job or doing that role, then they need to facilitate the the things which are missing, so that the person in that role is able to work effectively within that role. Okay. Right. Now these are some of the functions that we get to see which HR is predominantly responsible for. Okay.
Right.
Now one of the key handouts that I'm going to send to you along with this presentation would be to summarize. Obviously we've looked at a bit more detail with those of mind maps, but just to summarize, what are the key functions, so that you can, if I have to ask you, can you give me four or five key functions which HR managers do? So what you need to be able to do is basically clearly come across that, okay, the HR department is tasked with the function of ensuring a couple of things. Their key functions are recruitment and selection, the training and development. They look at rewards management, wages, or payroll. They are also responsible for ensuring that we have a safe and safe working environment. And last but not the least, they are responsible for looking at appraisals, solving our grievances, and anything to do with meeting compliance, which is law and legislation within the within the role of HR. And that is what I have this handout for, which I'm going to send along, so that the functions that we've discussed today, the 6 different functions, majorly, productivity, motivation, I'm going to tend to group them together, right? So there are 6 functions to look at, and those are the ones that you will need to understand, so that you clearly know from an overview point of view what is the role and responsibility of HR within a particular organization. Okay. Any questions on this far? You okay with this, Qasim? Yeah, so that is where I'm going to kind of